I wanted to do a video on database storage in Flutter apps. So the library that you will be using for that is called SQFlite. So SQFlite is a SQLite database for Flutter, and it works on both Android and iOS. So there's not really a lot that you need to do for each platform outside of just installing the library. So you can see here at the docs, we have our SQLite documentation. You just install this dependency here, and I'll walk through this a bit later as we write our app. So let's go to an app that we have here. I've installed the Flutter bloc library. So if you're not familiar with bloc, please look at the video that I did on using bloc in Flutter. There should be a link at the top of the screen right now. I also installed the SQFlite package and the path package. So you'll see why we have the path package here in a second. And if we go to our code here, I have a food model, which right now it doesn't do anything, but we have a few different fields here. We have name, ID, calories, and it is vegan. That's a Boolean. And then I have a food form. So if I press the add button here in our app, you see the food form here. So these two are text form fields, and this is a switch. And then we have a submit button here. And also in our code, I am also showing different buttons if we already have a existing food when we go to the screen. So if we pass a food to the screen, then that means that we want to edit the food. So I have two different buttons here that say update and cancel. So you'll see that once we go to add our foods. But for now, this is what you'll see if you are trying to create a new food. And that is this button here. So we have submit, on pressed, we validate using the form in Flutter, and we save the current state of the form, and then we go back to the previous screen. So I can put something in here now and just put a number in here and press submit, and we go back to the previous screen, but nothing is actually being saved right now. So that's what we want to change for our app. We want the food to be saved to the app, and we want to show that food item in a list here. Okay? This is our food list class. It's a stateful widget. And if we go down to our build here, I have a container, and I'm using the bloc consumer. If you're not familiar with bloc, again, go see my previous video that I did on using bloc. So if you are familiar with the provider package, then the bloc consumer is similar to the consumer class or the consumer widget in the provider package. So when we add a new food to our bloc, this list gets notified and it gets rebuilt based on the food list here. Okay, and then in our list view, we take each food item and we add that text here for the name, and we add the calories here. There's a string for that, and we add a vegan name here. So if it's true or false, this will say vegan true or vegan false. Okay, and then on tap, we show a food dialog. I can't test this right now until we add a food, but you can see here that we have a builder context. We have the title as the food name. We're showing the food ID. That's just for debugging purposes. And we're showing a update button here, a delete button, and a cancel button. So the cancel just cancels the dialog. So this bloc is very similar to the bloc that I created in our previous video on bloc. The difference in this video versus that previous video is that instead of having everything in one event class, I created 4 different events. So we have add food event. So we send a new food to the add food event. We send the index to the delete food event. And this is our abstract parent class. So all of these other events extend that food event. And then we have our set foods, which takes in the food list. And then we have update food.dart, which updates the new food at the current index. Okay, and back to the food block, we're testing to see if the event is set foods, add food, delete food, or update food. If it's set foods, then we yield back the entire food list. If it's add food, then we add that new food to the state. And then if it's delete food, then we remove that food, and then we return back to new state. And then if it's update food, then we update the food at the given index with the new food, and then we yield the new state. So one more time, if this doesn't make sense, go back to my video that I did on using bloc in Flutter. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the initial code. And now I want to create a new folder here. I want to create a folder called DB. And then in the DB folder, I'm going to put a new file. I'm going to call it, let's call it database provider.dart. And this class will hold all of our database code. So Normally you would want to separate out your database code from the rest of your app, just to keep everything very modular. Okay, so first let's create the class. Let's do class database provider. And then I want to create a few static constants here. So I want to say static constant string table food, and this is going to be equal to food. So our table name for our database will be called food. And I'm going to create 4 different columns. I'm going to skip through this video fast so you don't have to watch me type all this stuff out. Okay, so now we have our 4 different columns here. We have ID, name, calories, and vegan. And now I want to create a private constructor. So let's do database provider dot underscore is how you create a private constructor. And then I want to say static final database provider db equals database provider with our private constructor. So this db object is how we will access the database in this class here. So whenever we want to perform an operation on our database, we use this db object here. So let's also create a database underscore database. And this will be used only in one place in this file. You'll see here in a second. Now I'm going to create a getter for our database object. It'll be a feature. So all of these will be features. So it'll be feature database get. So that's a getter database, and this will be async. Okay. So this is a synchronous getter to return our database object. And if you want to, you can print something here. You can say database getter called. And then I want to say if underscore database is not equal to null, then I want to return the database object. Okay. And if that's not true, then I want to say underscore database equals await. So we're awaiting this method here that we're going to create. I'm going to name it create database. And then after we create the database here, I want to return that object. So this is pretty much like a singleton here inside of our getter. So let's now create this function. So we do feature, and this returns a database object. So we do feature database, and we say create. Let's copy and paste this here. This will also be async, so we need to do async. And now we want to create a path to our database. So I'm going to say string db path equals await get database path. So get database path, if you hover over this, as part of the SQLite package, it opens the default database location. I like this package a lot because you don't have to worry about the individual locations on both Android and iOS. This takes care of it for you on both platforms. Okay, so now we have a path to where our database will reside. And now I want to say return await, and I'm going to call a function called open database. So open database is part of the SQLite package too. So you can hover over this. It says it opens the database at a given path, and it takes in a lot of different parameters here. Some are optional. So in our open database path, first I'm going to create a join here. So join, and I'm going to join the DB path that we just created with the name food DB. So it'll be food DB. Let's uppercase that .db. So whenever you create a database on either Android or iOS, always create it with the .db extension here. So that stands for database. So if you hover over join joins the given path parts into a single path using the current platform's example. So you put in the path and you put in some name here. Okay. So this would be something that you do all the time with SQLite in general, or SQFlite with Flutter. And now we put the version in here. So there's a version parameter here. So version, and we could just name it 1. In the future, whenever you want to update your database structure, like the columns, for example, in your database, you need to bump the version up to the next number. In our case, it'll be 2. So if I change these at some point after I create the database for the first time, then I want to change the version to 2 before I release my app. Okay, and now I want to say on create. So this would be another field that you use all the time. So on create is where you actually create the database itself. This is where you actually name the table and you name the columns here too. So you can see it says DB and version here. So we put those in here. We say database. So it takes in the database, and we could just call it database. And then it takes in the int version here. Okay, and this will be asynchronous. And now we want to put something here. Let's first put a print line here. So we could say print creating food table for debugging. And then we do await. So this is how you create the database. You do await, and then you want to do database. So this has to match the getter up here. Remember, from now on, we're not using this underscore. This underscore is only used in the getter here. So whenever you want to get the database itself, you use just the word database here. Okay, so await database and then dot execute. So execute takes in the actual string query for your database. And in our case, we're trying to create it here. So we do execute, and let's put this on a different line. Let's do create and table, and then I'm going to do $, table food. So we're doing a string format here for the table food, and then parentheses. So this part I have written down because I never memorized how to do this by heart. And you can easily make a mistake if you're putting all of this in a string like I am here. So parentheses, and then let's do $, column ID. So we're defining our column ID here as an integer. So we do integer, and this will be a primary key. This video assumes that you already know a little bit about SQL. You know about IDs and keys and primary keys and how that works with your database, and how primary key auto increments in SQL if you wanted to. SQFlite takes care of a lot of that stuff for you, which is nice. So yeah, I like it a lot. And then we do comma, and we'll do our next column. So I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to copy and paste this here, and let's do column name. And we can get rid of this part here, and we could put in a text. So this is a text column here. And then let's do paste, and this one will be calories. Calories will also be a text object here. It doesn't have to be, but for our app it is. If you go back to the food model, you can see that calories is a string. And then we have our column vegan here. Okay, and this one is an integer. So you cannot put a bool instead of a database. So you have to define it as either a 0 or 1, which represents false and true. So put an integer in here, and we can get rid of this last comma here, close parentheses here, and then we put a comma here. Okay, and make sure some of these are lined up correctly. Your braces. Yeah, we need a semicolon here. Okay, and that should be good. Let's put that here. Okay, and that's it for our open database. You'll definitely want to double check this after you create this to make sure that all of your columns are correct. You might have to go back here and redo this a few times to make sure that everything works correctly. So now that we have this part, I want to use my column names here as our food map names in our food model. So let's go back to our food model. And I created those constants because I didn't want to retype out the same names in different places in my app. So I created some constants to use. So instead of our to map here, I want to map the database column names from the field names. So we're going to set the database column names here. Let's first say database provider dot column name. We'll come back to the ID in a second, but let's do name first. We'll just set it to be name or name. And this should be inside of the brackets here. And then I'm going to copy and paste this 2 more times. So let's do paste, and we'll do column calories, and column vegan is vegan. But for here, this is a Boolean, right? So these are strings, so these lines are okay. But for the Boolean, remember we need to put in either a 0 or a 1, not a true or false. So in order to do this, we can use a shortcut. We could say question mark. So this will be a ternary operation. So if isVegan is true, then we put a 1, else we put a 0. So that's just a little shortcut way of either putting a 1 or a 0 in your column name here. Okay, and for the ID, we need to do something a little bit different. So let's go down here and say if ID not equal to null, then I want to put the map field of the database. Database, cannot type today. Database provider dot column ID and set it equal to ID. Because our ID might not exist the first time that we create this map. So in order to get the ID, we have to put the food into the database first, and then we get that ID back. And you'll see how this works later on. So let's go down to our from map constructor here, and we'll do the opposite of what we did up here. We'll set the fields from our database. So let's say ID equals map, and then we put in a database provider dot ID, column ID. And then I'm going to copy and paste this 3 more times. And this will be dot column name. This will be dot column calories and dot column vegan. Let's change these here. Name, calories, and is vegan. But once again, we cannot do this because this is a 0 or 1. And we're trying to set it to a Boolean, so we need to change this back to a Boolean here. I'm going to say equals 1. So if this is 1, then 1 equals 1, and this will be true. And so we put true into here. If this is 0, then the statement is false. So we put false into isVegan. So it's just a little shortcut way of putting the correct Boolean value from our integer back into the field. Okay, hope that makes sense. So that's it for our food model here. We're using the toMap function here to map the field names to our database columns, and we're using the from map field here to map our field names from our database columns here. So now let's go back to our database provider class here. Let's write a function to get a list of foods. So first I'm going to create a function that is a feature, and it's going to return a list of food objects. And I'm going to name it get foods. This is going to be async too. These will all be async. Okay, let's import our food model here. And for our get foods function, I'm going to say final db equals await database. So you'll see this line a lot in our other functions. We are creating a DB object from our database getter. So remember, this is our getter here. So our getter is a future. So we need to await our future. Maybe this takes a long time, maybe it doesn't. Normally it shouldn't take a long time, but if it does, then this will wait for that line to complete, and then we'll get our DB object here. So after this, I want to say var foods. I want to say equals await. So we await again a DB. So once you create this line here, then we access our queries using DB, or we execute our queries using DB. So DB dot query is how you write your query here. And then we pass in, you can see here, we pass in a table, and then we pass in some various other options here that are all optional. So the table is required. The other things are not required. Okay, so let's put in our table here, and let's put table food because we have that as a constant here. So now we need to write what columns we want to retrieve. There's a field for that. It's called columns. You can see here it takes a list of string columns. So columns, and then we just name the different columns here. So we say column ID, column name, column calories, column vegan. Okay, so we've defined our column names here. That's all we need to do for this query. So after the query completes, we can create a new food list. So let's do list food list. It'll be an empty list of foods at first. Okay, and then I want to say foods dot for each. So we have a for each loop here, and I'm going to name this one current food. So for each current food that we find in our database, I want to define a new food. So let's say food equals food dot from map, and then I'm going to pass in the current food. Okay, so current food, you can see here, is a map. So whenever you retrieve data from your database, it'll be in the form of a map. So that's why we created that from map field in our model. So we get the data from our database here, we map it to the model, to the food model here that we have. So we have our food model here defined. Now we just add that to the list. So food list, let's make this lowercase, food list dot add, and then we add the food to the list. Okay, and that's it for our get foods. So I created this empty food list here just in case we have no foods in our database, which is the case right now. Then we just pass back a empty food list. Oh yeah, and then we need to return that food list. So we do return food list. That's the most complex that our functions will get in our database provider class here. So let's go down here and we'll create a future, and it'll be returning the type of food. So let's do insert, and we insert the food. So we pass the food object to this class or to this function, and this will be asynchronous. So async, and then I'm going to copy and paste this same line up here. And then for the insert, I want to say food dot ID. So I'm actually defining the ID after we insert the food. So I'm going to say equals, and now we insert the food. We do await db dot, and then you have a insert function here. So you can see it says table and values. So the table is of course table food, and the values is the map that we create in our food model. So you can go back here, and we have two map here. So we map the field names to our database columns. Okay, so we can say food dot to map. Okay, and that's actually it for our insert method. It's only 2 lines, pretty simple. Oh yeah, we need to return that again. I keep forgetting to return. So we return the food model here. So pretty easy, 3 lines of code. Not really a lot to go over here, except that we are defining the ID in our food object after we insert it. So before I go to the other functions here, I want to test inserting a food and retrieving our foods. So let's go to the food list screen, and you can see we have our build with our list here and our block consumer that's listening for updates in the food block. So I want to get our foods when we load this food list state. So I'm going to go into our state here, and I'm going to create a init state method. So I'm going to override the init state method. This is our initial state, and now I want to get our foods. So in order to use our database provider here, you can see that we have a static final DB here. So DB is how you access the database provider in your other classes. So this is static final, so we will not create a new instance of our database provider outside of this class here. Okay, so let's go back to our food list, and we can just say database provider dot db because it's static, and then we can call our database methods from here. So we can say db dot get foods. So we're getting our foods here as a future. So with the future, I want to say dot then, because after we get our foods, I want to do something else after that. So let's put this on a different line. This will be our food list. So let's just name this food list. So after this, I want to add our food list to our block. So I want to say block provider dot of is how you access the provider object, and then of type food block, and then we pass in the context here, and then I want to say dot add. So dot add is part of the block library, so we say block dot add, and then I want to define the event this event is going to be our set foods. So we have set foods here as a food event. So let's go back here and say set foods, and we pass in the food list. So this will be a recurring theme that you see in this video. Let's do that. Okay. Put a comma here. Let's do comma. Let's make this look a little bit nicer. Okay. So we're getting the food list from our database. After we have our food list, we're putting that into the block using the set foods event here. So block makes things pretty handy. I don't want to pass this around too much if I don't have to, so I want to set our food list instead of our block provider. So whenever you want to see the entire list of foods at the current moment in different classes, you can use block to get your list of foods. Okay, so if we reload this now, nothing will really change. Okay, so if we reload this, nothing should really change. Yeah, we don't have anything in our list here, but we see our log lines getting called, database getter called, building entire food list. So let's go try to, oh yeah, first we have to add a food. So let's go to our food form, and we need to add something to our submit button here when we go to add a food. So let's go to our food form. And after we save our state for our form, I want to first create a new food object. So I'm going to say food equals food. And then I'm going to pass in our different fields here. So name, let's do this on a different line. Name would be underscore name. That's what we define these up here. We have underscore name, calories, and it is vegan. So also notice that I have in our init state, I created this before. I say if we already have a food being passed to this class, so we can pass in food and food index. If we already have this, then I want to just set the state for that food that we pass in. So let's just do underscore name, and then we have calories, underscore calories, vegan is vegan, underscore is vegan. Okay. So we have our new food object that we created from our form here. And now I want to do something similar that we did with our get foods method. I want to insert our food into our database now. So I want to say database provider dot db, same format, dot insert now. So we insert this food object into our database now. So insert food dot then, because it's also a feature. Okay, and for this, I want to put, let's call it stored food. And then I want to call our block again. So let's do block provider dot of food block, pass in our context, dot add, and then we add the event that we want to invoke. And the event will be add foods. So going to the add food event here, you can see we pass in a food for a new food. So just do add food, and then we just pass in the stored food here. This would be like this, okay? And then we can semicolon, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so we insert our food into our database. We await that feature after it completes. Then we tell block that we've added a new food and pass in the stored food, and the block gets updated with that new food. And then our list should get updated too, because if we go back to our food list here, our block consumer is listening for the food block. So whenever something changes in the food block, this will get updated. And then we have our new food list, which should have our new food that we just inserted into our list. And we should see it show up in the food list on the screen. So let's actually try and create a new food. Let's say burger, calories, we'll just do this number. Let's say it's vegan is true, and let's press submit and see what happens. Submit. So we don't see our food list. So we don't see our burger in the food list. Why is that? Let's try and reload and see if we see it. No, we still don't see it. So let's go back to our food form. And everything looks okay here. Let's go back to our database provider. And let's look at the insert method. That looks okay. Let's go to our get foods method. And this looks okay. So let's go to the food list again and check our init state. So let's put a print line inside of here. Let's put the brackets here. semicolon. Okay, and let's put print food list here. Let's reload. You can see we have no food list items in our array here. So let's look at our insert again. And I'm going to put a print line here. Print, let's do food.id. And let's try to add a new food. Let's do pizza. Okay, now it's working. Let's test it out again. Let's do burger and submit. Okay, so now you can see that we've inserted different foods into the app here. Let's reload just to be sure that our get foods is working correctly. Okay, so everything looks good now. We can get rid of these print lines here. Let's go back here. So we have this working now. So now let's write a method to delete our foods in our database provider. Okay, let's go down here and say future int. So we're saying int here because the delete method will return the number of lines that were deleted from your database if the query is successful. If it didn't find any matches, then it will return 0. So let's do future int delete, and then we pass in the ID of the food that we want to delete. So we do int ID. This will be async, and then we do same thing here. Let's copy paste this here, and we'll return await. So you can see a pattern here with these. Return await db dot, now we say delete. So delete takes in a few different things here. It takes in a table and a lot of optional arguments. So you have where and where arguments. So let's put the table name in here first. Let's do table food. And then first we'll create the where argument. So we could say where, and then we define a string here that shows where we want to delete the food. So we delete where ID equals question mark. And the question mark will be what this ID is here. And then we have where arguments. So it'll be where arguments is the ID. And be sure you put it inside the brackets here. So it'll put this ID into this question mark value here. So it'll delete the food items where the ID is equal to this ID here. Okay, and that's it for our delete method. While we're here, let's create our last function, and that'll be the future int update method. So now we pass in the new food value. So it'll be food, be async, copy paste this, and now we can say return await db dot update, pass in the table name, table food, and then we pass in the values that we want to actually put into the database. Food to map, because remember you have to pass in a map to your database. So to map. So now we do the where and where arguments. So we can copy and paste this, paste. So now this line will be the same, but now we say where arguments food.id. So hope that makes sense. We're updating this food.id with the new food value as a map here. Okay, so let's go back to our food list and use these functions. While we're here, let's test out the show dialog here. So if you press on one of these items, you'll see a dialog here. The dialog has the food name, which is burger, the food ID, which is 2. Keep in mind, this is not the index in the list. This is the ID that was assigned when you insert it into the database. If I delete the pizza here, the burger ID will still be 2. Okay, and then we have our update, delete, and cancel. So cancel just pops the alert dialog away. Delete and update we have to change. So let's first work on delete. Database provider dot db dot delete. We pass in the ID. That's why I'm actually passing the food and index into the show food dialog. So we're using the food ID here. So we'll do food dot ID, and then we'll do our dot then. And we're not going to use this value. You can just put underscore if you want to here. And then we'll say block provider dot of. Don't forget the food block here, food block. And then we pass in the context. So I pass in the context here to the show food dialog. And then we do dot add. So we're adding the event. So we have the delete food event. We pass in the index here. So after we delete the food from our database, then we delete the food from our block provider. And this delete food event takes in the int here. And then if we go back to our food block, if we are deleting a food, then we take the list and we remove the food in that list in the new state here, and then we return that new state. And I forgot to go over the add food here. And the add food, when we add a new food to our database, then we add a new food to the list here by setting a new state and saying if the new food is not null, then we add a new food to that food list, and then we return that new state. Okay, so that's actually all we need to do for our delete method. So let's reload our app. Now let's try to delete our pizza first. So let's press delete. You can see it's gone. But I also forgot to remove our or pop our navigator. So let's do this and this. Okay. There we go. And then under here, I want to do navigator dot pop context. Okay, let's reload. And you can see our burger ID is still 2. Now let's press delete. Then we delete and we pop our navigator, and now we have an empty list, and we can reload the app again. You can see our list is still empty. So let's go up here to our update button. And for the update button, we're not going to have any logic here to update our database because we want to go to the food form first. And as you can see, we're already doing that here. We're passing the food and food index to the food form. So let's go and try to add a new food again. Let's do pie, calories, something. Let's press submit. And let's add a couple more. Let's do burger, something, submit. Oops, this has to be a number. Submit. Let's do peanut, some calories. Let's make it vegan. Submit. And now let's try to go update. Let's update burger. So let's update. And you can see that our fields are already set here. And that's because in our food form, we are setting that from our widget.food name in our init state, because we have a widget.food item that exists. So now let's go down to our update section here for our button. And we will copy and paste this food object here. So let's put that into here. Okay, and now as we did up here, I'm actually going to copy and paste this to make it faster. So let's put this down here, and now I want to say db.update. We're passing in our food like before. We're getting our food from our widget.food. So that's the food that's coming from the previous screen because that has an ID. This food right here does not have an ID yet because it has not been inserted into the database yet. So be sure you use the food from the previous screen, not this newly created food. Okay, and after this we have our stored food, and now we can just keep this the same. It doesn't really matter. And for this, now I want to say update food. And for our update food, we're passing in the index and the food. So we need to pass in the widget.food index because we're passing that in from here. So keep in mind, this is the food index in the list. This is not the food ID. If it was the food ID, I could just pass in this .food and get the food ID from that. But the block needs to know the index in order for it to update the food state, the food list state correctly. So we have widget.foodIndex, and then we pass in the food object, the new food here. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. That's probably the most complex part of this video is the update food part. So that's why I saved it for the last function. So we're telling the food block to update the food at this index in the list here, with this new food. After we insert the food, or after we update the food from the previous screen in the database. Okay, and let's go to the food block real quick and look at the update food method, or the update food condition here. We take the list as a new state, we use the food index, we set the new food to that food index. So the food that we created in the food form here, like if we changed like this, then the new food will have this name here. Okay, so let's actually go and test this out now. So let's reload. And I'm gonna go to burger 6 and let's do update. And let's change the burger 6 to burger 1000. And let's change the calories to 123. And let's change its vegan to true. And let's press update and see what happens. Update. And now you can see that our burger list has been updated to 1000, 123, and true. And we can play around with all these all you want to, and you can see that these will always be updated correctly. So you can see update, and now we can delete this, and we can create more. We can say ham, save. So yeah, this covers SQFlite and Flutter. It's a great tool to use if you want to store persistent data in your app. It's great for like note-taking app. You can also use this in combination with your backend. So if you get something from your backend and you want to store like a subset of that information in your app, you can store that information in your SQFlite database. If you look at the docs here, then you can see that there's different like types of transactions that you can do with SQFlite. This example is kind of like a to-do app here. It's very similar to what I did in the video, but I wanted to show you why things are done the way they are in this library. So I hope this video has helped you out, and stay tuned for more videos in the future, and happy coding. Bye.